I remember the sound changing before I remember seeing him. The battlefield had been a constant roar until that moment, artillery thumping like a diseased heart, las bolts cracking overhead, the wet percussion of bodies meeting rubble. Then abruptly, everything seemed to recede, as if the noise itself had flinched. My ears rang, not from an explosion, but from the sudden absence of meaning in all that sound. It was as if the world had inhaled and decided not to breathe out again. I was crouched behind the burned out husk of a transport, my back pressed against metal still warm from recent fire. The air stank of propellant and scorched plasteel, layered beneath the copper, sweet smell of blood that clung to the ruins like a curse. I remember my hands shaking as I tried to reload a rifle I barely knew how to use, fingers slick with grime and fear. I was not trained, I was not brave, I was simply not dead yet, and that, I would soon learn, was enough to condemn me. The shadow fell first. It cut across the rubble like an eclipse, blotting out the fires and the sky in one sweeping motion. I looked up despite every instinct screaming at me to stay hidden, to stay small, to remain irrelevant. The shadow had weight. It pressed down on the ground, on my chest, on my thoughts. Then the giant stepped into view. He was not shaped like a man so much as a verdict. Layers of ceramite plate overlapped his frame, scarred and blackened. Each impact marker recorded survival. Warning sigils and devotional script were etched into his armor, prayers fossilized in metal. Power cables snaked along his limbs like veins, and every movement carried the sound of mass displaced with absolute certainty. When he walked, the ground did not merely shake, it acknowledged him. I had seen them before at a distance. Everyone had. They were spoken of in sermons and picked, feeds with reverence bordering on terror, angels of the emperor, living weapons. The Imperium's final argument made flesh, but seeing one up close stripped away the mythology and left only scale and inevitability. Standing there, knee-deep in debris and corpses, I understood the truth that propaganda never admits gods do not need you to believe in them. His helm turned, that was all. No gesture, no words, just the slight, precise rotation of his head, lenses fixing on me through smoke and flame. The sensation was immediate and intimate, like being pinned under a blade. The battlefield noise surged back, but it felt distant now, secondary. My world had narrowed to that gaze, to the realization that something vast and ancient had noticed me specifically. I froze. The rifle slipped from my fingers and clattered against the rubble. The sound absurdly loud in my ears. I waited for the bolt round that would end it, for the casual execution reserved for those who inconvenienced the war by existing in the wrong place. Instead, the giant raised one gauntleted hand, not to fire, but to point. You. His vox boomed, the word amplified and layered, vibrating in my bones. It was not anger, it was not interest, it was selection. Before I could process what that meant, he was on me. A single step closed the distance I would have needed a dozen strides to cross. His armored hand clamped around the front of my coat and lifted me off the ground with effortless contempt for gravity. My boots kicked uselessly in the air as I gasped, the breath crushed from my lungs by the pressure of ceramite against my chest. Useful, he said, the word emerging from his vox, grill like a classification code. Useful, it hit harder than any blow. Not spared, not saved, useful, a term stripped of sentiment, heavy with implication. I was not being removed from danger. I was being reassigned within it. He dragged me from behind cover as if pulling debris from a path, my body slamming into broken stone and twisted metal. Pain flared and dulled again, reduced to background noise by sheer terror. Shots cracked past us, some striking his armor and ricocheting away in showers of sparks. He did not slow, did not flinch. Each impact was nothing more than data to be processed and ignored. The air grew hotter as we moved, closer to the front where fires burned unchecked and the dead lay in heaps too dense to count. I smelled burned meat, human, unmistakably, and bile rose in my throat. Somewhere nearby someone was screaming for a medic. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, final sound. The war did not pause to acknowledge it. He dropped me behind a low wall of rubble with a force that knocked the breath from me all over again. I collapsed onto my hands and knees, coughing, retching dust and blood. My ears rang, and for a moment the world tilted, threatening to go dark. Stay, the giant ordered. I stayed, not because I wanted to, because my body understood before my mind did that disobedience was not an option that existed in this reality. I curled in on myself instinctively, making myself small, feeling the vibration of his footsteps as he moved past me, weapon roaring as he fired into the smoke. I realized then that survival had not spared me, it had reclassified me. Around us, the battle raged with renewed violence. Explosions hammered the ruins, shockwaves rippling through the ground. Dust filled the air until every breath tasted like ground bone. Over it all, the Space Marine's presence dominated, not just physically, but conceptually. He moved with purpose, every action part of a larger calculus I could not see. I was aware of myself in a new, humiliating way, my weight, my reach, the strength left in my arms. I could feel myself being measured without instruments, evaluated by something that did not consider feelings or futures. I was inventory, a resource identified in the field. When he turned back to me, I flinched, expecting pain. Instead, he tossed something at my feet, a crate, scorched and dented, heavy enough to make the ground thud when it landed. "Chari," he said. And just like that, my old life, the one where I was a person, however insignificant, ended completely. There was no paperwork, no oath, no ceremony, just a word spoken by a god in ceramite, and my fate was sealed tighter than any chain. As I reached for the crate with shaking hands, the air still thick with smoke and screams, I made my first true confession. I had prayed to survive this war. I had never considered what survival might actually require. I learned the rhythm of his movement the way a prisoner learns the rhythm of a guard's boots, not out of admiration, but because misjudging it could get you killed. He did not walk so much as advance, each step a decision already made, each pause a calculation. The battlefield bent around him in subtle ways. Friendly troops threw themselves flat when he passed, not out of respect alone but out of instinct, as if the air displaced by his armor could crush smaller bodies. Even the smoke seemed to part reluctantly, revealing him in harsh silhouettes before swallowing everything again. The crate he had thrown at my feet was heavier than it looked, its edges biting into my palms as I tried to lift it. The lid was half warped from heat, the latch jammed, and faintly I could hear the rattle of contents inside, metal cylinders knocking together like teeth, ammunition, spare components, things meant to keep the war running. I got it off the ground only by using my knee and my entire body, muscles protesting immediately. The Space Marine did not wait. He simply moved, and the gap between us threatened to become my grave. I lurched after him, stumbling over rubble, the crate bouncing against my thigh with every step. My breath came in harsh, burning pulls, smoke scraping my lungs raw. I tasted dust and copper, and each time I swallowed I felt grit grind between my teeth. A Vox order crackled from his helm, low enough that it was more vibration than sound. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the tone, clipped, efficient, the voice of something that believed itself entitled to obedience. Then his head turned slightly, lenses flicking toward me. "Close," he commanded. "Close. Not safe, not sheltered. Close." He reached out without slowing, grabbed the back of my coat, and yanked me forward so violently the crate nearly slipped from my hands. I stumbled, caught myself, and felt my shoulder scream as something strained. His gauntlet released me as abruptly as it had seized me, but the message was clear. I was expected to keep pace, and if my body could not, he would force it until it broke. We moved through the ruins like a knife through meat. Firelight flickered across broken masonry and twisted beams. The ground was littered with the debris of a city being erased, shattered shrine, statues, cracked Vox relays, half-melted prayer slates. Bodies lay among it all, some whole, some not, faces turned upward in frozen expressions of surprise or pleading. No one stopped for them. Stopping was inefficient. A shell landed somewhere ahead, the explosion flattening what remained of a hab, block into a cloud of dust and screaming fragments. The shockwave slapped into me, nearly throwing me off my feet. I instinctively ducked and flinched away, the crate tilting dangerously. The Space Marine's hand snapped out and struck the side of the crate, hard, controlled, a correction more than a blow. The impact jolted through my arms and into my chest. "Hold," he said, and I realized he meant both the crate and myself. "Hold your position. Hold your function. Hold your fear inside your throat where it won't slow you down. I tried. Emperor, I tried. The war continued indifferently around us. Guardsmen ran in ragged lines, shouting over one another, dragging wounded, firing blindly into smoke-choked streets. A Vox caster somewhere screamed for coordinates, for support, for anything. The response, if there was one, was drowned out by another barrage. Somewhere to my left, a heavy weapon tore through a wall, sending stone shards spraying like shrapnel. A man screamed as something took his leg clean off. The scream lasted only a second before the next sound replaced it, because the battlefield does not allow any one agony to monopolize attention. The Space Marine shoved me behind a collapsed column as fire stitched the air in front of us. Bolts hissed overhead, leaving trails of heat that made my skin prickle. I crouched instinctively, hugging the crate like a child clinging to a relic. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might punch through my ribs. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard his vox again, this time directed at me. Forward. I stared at him, uncomprehending. Forward meant into the fire lane. Forward meant the place where beams were cutting the air into lethal threads. I shook my head once, a reflexive denial, and immediately regretted it. His helm tilted, and for an instant I felt like an insect that had displeased a boot. He seized my collar again and hauled me out from behind cover, pushing me ahead of him with one armored shove. The force was obscene, my feet skidded over rubble, and I nearly fell. The crate slipped from my grasp, but I clung to it desperately, fingers white with strain, hesitation. He said, voice like iron grinding, eyes failure. He did not shout, he did not need to. The statement was simply a fact, the way gravity is a fact. Hesitation equals failure. Failure equals correction. The Imperium's logic, condensed into a single line spoken by a weapon that lived it. I ran, not well, not gracefully, but I ran, hunched low, crate banging against my hip and thigh, breath tearing at my throat. Last bolts snapped past me, close enough that I felt their heat against my cheek. One struck the rubble beside my foot and exploded into molten fragments. Pain flared across my calf as a shard embedded itself. I screamed high and humiliating, and kept running because stopping would have been worse. Behind me, the Space Marine advanced in my wake, using my movement the way a commander uses a probe. I understood it with sick clarity. My smaller body could fit into spaces he could not, could draw fire from angles his armor might shrug off, but his mission could not afford to ignore. I was a test, a bait, a disposable indicator. The realization did not make me brave. It made me numb. We reached a gap between two shattered walls, a narrow corridor of rubble that led toward the objective, whatever that objective was. The Space Marine stopped, towering behind me, and looked down as if evaluating a tool. Proceed, he ordered. Mark resistance, as if enemy fire were a form to be filled out, as if my fear could be translated into actionable data. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to vomit, I wanted to beg, but my throat closed around all of it, leaving only a dry, painful swallow. I stepped into the gap. The world narrowed again, not with awe this time but with dread. The air inside the rubble corridor was stale and hot, filled with dust so thick it coated my tongue. Every sound was amplified by the close walls, the scrape of my boots, the rattle of the crate, the distant roar of battle like an ocean beyond a cave mouth. A shot cracked from somewhere ahead, a sharp, distinct sound different from last fire. The bullet, solid, real, whined past my ear close enough to make it ring. I flinched, stumbled, and the crate nearly fell. Continue. The Space Marine's vox boomed from behind, a reminder that retreat was not in the approved options list. So I continued, step by step, forward into unknown fire, feeling my life reduced to a function walk, carry, survive long enough to provide information. I was no longer a civilian. But I was not a soldier either. Soldiers are trained, armed, given the illusion of agency. I was simply flesh being pressed into service because it was available. At the end of that corridor, the rubble opened into a wider street where the air shimmered with heat and smoke. I froze for half a heartbeat, staring at the chaos beyond, and felt a jolt as the Space Marine's gauntlet struck my back, not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to remind me who owned my momentum. Move, he said, and I did, because the war did not care what I wanted, and the giant behind me cared even less. The crate became my world, not metaphorically, not in some poetic attempt to give meaning to suffering, but literally. Its weight dictated my posture, my pace, my breathing. Its corners bruised my thighs raw, its underside scraped skin from my palms until sensation dulled into a distant, useless echo. Everything beyond it, the war, the ruins, the screaming sky, blurred into background noise filtered through pain. The Space Marine did not tell me what was inside. He did not need to. I learned through the way my arms shook and my spine screamed that it was important enough to be carried by flesh rather than dropped, important enough that servitors or tracked carriers had been deemed inefficient, important enough that I had been deemed the solution. We moved through places machines could not follow, collapsed stairwells where the ceiling sagged low and rebar clawed downward like rusted fingers, narrow service alleys choked with debris and bodies, the ground uneven and treacherous. Rubble shifted underfoot with every step, threatening to send me sprawling. The Space Marine ducked and adjusted effortlessly, his armor scraping stone, his movements economical and precise. When he slowed, it was not for me, it was because the terrain demanded it. I lagged behind almost immediately. My breath came in ragged gasps, lungs burning with smoke and exertion. Each inhale tasted like ash and iron. My vision tunneled, edges darkening, and I had to blink hard to keep the world from collapsing inward. Sweat poured down my face and into my eyes, stinging like acid. I stumbled once, knees slamming into broken masonry, pain flaring sharp and bright. The crate slipped. For a heartbeat it tilted, and the sound it made, a heavy hollow thud as one corner struck stone, felt louder than any explosion. I froze, terror spiking, waiting for correction. It came immediately. The Space Marine struck the crate with his gauntlet, not violently, but decisively, knocking it back into alignment and into my arms again. The impact reverberated through my bones. Momentum, he said, voice flat. Maintain. Momentum, a word stripped of nuance. Not speed, not urgency, momentum. As if stopping even to breathe were a flaw in physics rather than a consequence of flesh. I nodded frantically, not trusting my voice, and lurched forward again. My muscles screamed in protest, tendons burning, joints grinding. I could feel skin peeling from my palms where sweat and friction had done their work. Blood slicked my grip, making the crate harder to hold, turning each step into a gamble. We passed another group of civilians, if that word still applied, huddled in the shell of a manufacturum loading bay. They were thin, filthy eyes hollow with shock. One of them looked up at me as I staggered past, hope flaring briefly in her expression. Help us, she rasped. I did not slow. I did not look back. I could not afford either. Behind me, the Space Marine did not even turn his helm. His world contained only vectors, threats, objectives. Anything else was clutter. The path narrowed into a slanted maintenance ramp half, buried under debris. It descended steeply, slick with oil and blood. The crate dragged at my arms, threatening to pull me forward into a fall that would shatter bone and end my usefulness instantly. Down. The Space Marine ordered. I hesitated, just a fraction of a second, as my mind calculated the risk. His hand closed around the back of my neck and shoved. I went down hard, boots skidding, crate crashing against my shins, pain exploding as I barely kept my grip. I slid the rest of the way on my backside, scraping skin from my legs. Breath knocked out of me in a wheezing gasp. The crate slammed into the ramp at the bottom with a bone, rattling thud. I lay there for a moment, staring at the smoke-choked ceiling, chest heaving, vision swimming. I tasted blood. I could not tell where it came from anymore. Everywhere hurt. Up, he said. So I got up. That was the pattern. Order, pain, compliance, repeat. Further along the route, we encountered another human pressed into the same role. A man older than me, his back bent under a load even larger than mine. His hands were wrapped in filthy rags soaked dark with blood. He moved with the jerky, desperate energy of someone already past their limits, driven forward by nothing but fear and proximity to something worse. He looked at me as we passed, eyes glassy, mouth working soundlessly. I recognized the look. It was the same one I had worn earlier, the silent question of how much longer a body could be forced to function. The answer came swiftly. His foot caught on a piece of twisted metal, and he went down with a choking cry. The load shifted violently, crushing him sideways against a wall. I heard ribs snap. The sound was unmistakable, intimate, obscene. He screamed once, then gurgled as blood flooded his mouth. The Space Marine did not stop. He stepped over the fallen man as if over rubble, glanced once at the shattered body, and keyed something into a wrist-mounted slate. The gesture was small, precise, logging, accounting. Then his helm turned toward me. "Take," he said. I stared at the fallen man's load, an absurd, panicked thought flashing through my mind that it was too much, that my body would not survive it. My body's opinion did not matter. I dropped my crate and moved toward the fallen one, hands shaking uncontrollably. The man was still alive, eyes rolling wildly as I approached. His lips trembled, trying to form words around the blood. "Please," he managed. I did not answer. I could not. I unhooked the harness from his shoulders while he screamed, the sound wet and broken. The moment the weight shifted away from him, his body convulsed once and went still. His eyes stared past me, unfocused, already elsewhere. I hooked the new load onto my harness. The weight nearly drove me to my knees. My spine screamed in protest, something in my lower back tearing with a sensation like hot wire. I cried out despite myself. A raw, animal sound ripped from my chest. "Acceptable strain," the Space Marine said, observing me with detached interest. "Proceed." I did not argue. I did not think. I moved because movement was the only thing keeping me from collapse, and collapse would mean replacement. The world narrowed again, every thought consumed by the simple mechanics of forward motion. With every step, I tasted blood and dust. My muscles trembled constantly now, threatening to give out without warning. My vision blurred, then doubled, then blurred again. Sounds came to me as if through water, the roar of distant weapons, the crack of gunfire, the low thunder of artillery. Through it all, the Space Marine advanced unburdened. He spoke occasionally, but only in the language of efficiency. "Faster. Adjust angle. Do not stop." Each word stripped of emotion, delivered with the certainty of someone whose body had never known this kind of weakness. I began to understand something then, in the fog of exhaustion and pain. The Imperium did not merely tolerate my suffering. It required it. Power armor could not feel fatigue. Servo motors did not tremble. Machines did not panic in confined spaces or hesitate at the edge of collapse. That was why I was here. Not despite my weakness, but because of it. Because flesh could be pushed into places and tasks that metal could not endure without breaking something far more valuable. When we finally reached the drop point, my legs gave out entirely. I collapsed forward, the load crashing down with me, vision exploding into white pain. I lay there gasping, chest heaving, unable to move. The Space Marine knelt beside the crate, inspected its seals and nodded once. "Delivered," he said, as if confirming a package receipt. He looked down at me then, truly looked, lenses lingering as if reassessing my condition. For a moment, just a moment, I dared to think he might release me, send me away, deem me no longer useful. Instead, he turned his head slightly and spoke into his vox. "Additional capacity confirmed," he reported. "Asset remains functional." Asset. I lay there in the rubble, barely conscious, my body screaming in protest, and understood the terrible truth. As long as I could still move, still carry, still suffer, I would be used. My pain was not a flaw in the system. It was proof that the system was working. I learned the shape of fear when it stops being sharp and becomes constant. At first, fear had been spikes, sudden, paralyzing flashes when shells landed too close, or when the Space Marine's shadow fell across me unexpectedly. But by the time Chapter 4 of my existence began, fear had settled into something heavier and more oppressive, like a low ceiling I could no longer stand upright beneath. It pressed down behind my eyes, tight and throbbing, never leaving, never escalating enough to demand release. I breathed fear the way I breathed smoke and dust, without thinking, because stopping meant choking. The order came without ceremony. "Advance," the Space Marine said, his helm angled toward a shattered intersection ahead. "Draw response. Not reconnoiter, not observe. Draw, as in pull, as in invite, as in place your unarmored, breakable body where the enemy is most likely to notice and react." I hesitated. Not because I didn't understand the command, but because understanding it made my legs refuse to move for a heartbeat too long. That heartbeat was enough. The Space Marine's armored hand struck the small of my back, not hard enough to cripple, not soft enough to ignore. The impact drove the breath from my lungs and sent me stumbling forward into open ground. "Go," he said. The street ahead was wide and broken, once a processional avenue lined with statues and banners. Now it was a killing field. Burned-out vehicles lay at odd angles, their frames twisted and blackened. Masonry had collapsed inward, forming jagged piles that offered illusionary cover at best. Smoke drifted in slow, lazy coils, carrying the stink of propellant. Scorched metal and burned flesh, so thick it coated the back of my throat. I moved because stopping was no longer a decision I could make. Each step felt like an announcement. My boots scraped loudly against stone. Loose debris shifted underfoot. I could hear my own breathing, ragged, panicked, too loud. Every instinct screamed at me to get low, to find cover, to disappear. But disappearing was not my function. The first shot cracked past my head with a sound like tearing cloth. I flinched violently, nearly falling, heart slamming against my ribs. The bullet struck a chunk of masonry behind me and exploded it into fragments that stung my back and neck. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but distant somehow, secondary to the terror flooding my system. Another shot followed, then another. I ran, not strategically, not bravely. I ran like prey, hunched and stumbling, arms flailing slightly as I tried to keep my balance under the weight of nothing but my own useless body. Each near miss tore the air beside me, close enough that I felt the displacement, the whisper of death brushing past my skin. Behind me, I knew, the Space Marine was watching. Not to protect me, not to intervene, but to observe, to measure angles, identify firing positions, assess weapon types and response times. I was a walking sensor array made of meat and panic. A last bolt burned a line across my left shoulder, searing through fabric and skin in an instant. I screamed. The sound ripped from my throat without permission, and nearly collapsed. The pain was blinding, white-hot, the smell of my own burned flesh nauseatingly sweet. I fell behind a half-collapsed plinth, gasping, clutching my shoulder as my vision swam. For a moment, just one, I dared to hope that the test was over, that I had drawn enough response, that I had fulfilled my function and might be allowed to stop. The Space Marine's shadow fell over me. "Move again," he said calmly. "They have adjusted." Adjusted, as if this were a training exercise. As if my terror were a variable on a slate. He kicked the plinth aside with a contemptuous shove, exposing me fully to the street. I scrambled to my feet, sobbing now, the sound humiliating and unstoppable. Tears streaked down my face, cutting clean lines through the grime and blood. I ran again. This time, the shots were closer. More accurate. The enemy had learned quickly. Something punched into my thigh, a glancing hit that spun me sideways and sent me crashing into the rubble. Pain exploded, and I screamed again, voice breaking into something animal and raw. I lay there, curled instinctively, waiting for the killing blow. It did not come. Instead, the Space Marine stepped past me, his armor soaking up fire that would have reduced me to pieces. Bolts struck him and shattered. Las fire splashed harmlessly across ceramite, enemy rounds pinging away like insults. He fired back with methodical precision, his weapon roaring, the sound impossibly loud and controlled all at once. As he advanced, the enemy fire shifted again, less concentrated, less confident. The test was complete. He knelt beside me once more, grasped my collar, and hauled me upright, as if I weighed nothing at all. My wounded legs screamed as it took weight again, but he did not pause. "Effective," he said, almost thoughtfully. "You absorb attention well. Absorb, not endure, not survive. Absorb." The word settled into me like poison. We moved on, leaving behind the street, the shattered statues, the blood I had spilled marking the path of his advance. The pain in my shoulder throbbed relentlessly now, each heartbeat a reminder that I was still alive, and therefore still useful. As we passed other Imperial troops, I saw the way they looked at me, not with pity, but with something like recognition. They knew what I was now. A thing used by something greater, a reminder that armor and rank might save them from becoming this, but not forever. The Space Marine occasionally corrected my posture, my pace, my direction, treating me like a tool that needed calibration. Lower profile. Angle left. Do not freeze. I obeyed every word. Fear had ceased to be an emotion. It was a constant condition, a pressure that never lifted. I no longer imagined survival as an outcome. Survival was incidental. My value lay entirely in how much danger I could intercept before something vital was threatened. By the time we reached the next position, my body was shaking uncontrollably, wounds burning, lungs on fire. I could barely stand. The Space Marine paused, watching me with those unreadable lenses. For a moment, I wondered if this was it, if I had finally reached the threshold where my irrelevance outweighed my usefulness. Instead, he turned away and spoke into his Vox. "Asset remains operational," he reported. "Low durability. High distraction yield." Distraction yield? I sagged against a wall, sliding down into a crouch, clutching my wounds and weeping silently. Around us, the war continued its endless, grinding work. Somewhere, artillery thundered. Somewhere, men died screaming. Somewhere, data was being logged. I understood then, with a clarity that cut deeper than any wound, I was not being protected by the Space Marine. I was being shielded by irrelevance. As long as my life was cheaper than his time, cheaper than his armor, cheaper than a single calculated risk, I would be thrown forward again and again until nothing remained to throw. He bled differently than I did. I noticed it the moment the crack split the air. A sharp, concussive impact that rang like a bell struck too hard. The Space Marine staggered half a step, not from pain, but from physics. A heavy round had hit him square in the torso, punching through layers of ceramite already weakened by hours of combat. The sound that followed was not a scream or a cry, but a grinding shriek as stressed metal failed. He did not fall. He turned, firing as he moved, weapon roaring in disciplined bursts that tore the firing position apart. Only when the immediate threat was reduced to silence did he step back into cover, movements controlled, precise. Smoke curled from the rent in his armor, and I could smell it then, hot ceramite, burned insulation, and something coppery beneath. Blood. Not much, but enough to matter. "Here," he said. That was all. He seized me by the shoulder, my burned, blistered shoulder, and dragged me into the narrow pocket of cover with him. Pain flared so violently my vision went white, and I screamed despite myself, a thin, broken sound swallowed by the ongoing war. He ignored it completely. "Hold," he ordered, positioning me against his chest. Only then did I understand what he meant. The damaged armor plate had fractured along one seam, flexing dangerously with every movement. Internal mechanisms were exposed beneath, sparking intermittently as the Titan-grade power systems within his suit struggled to compensate. The wound was not fatal, not yet, but it was inefficient. Left unattended, it would compromise mobility, response time, survivability. I was the solution. "Brace," he said, guiding my hands to the torn edge of the armor. The metal was still hot. I jerked reflexively as my palms made contact, skin screaming in protest as fresh burns blossomed across already raw flesh. The smell of searing skin rose instantly, nauseating and intimate. I gagged, bile burning my throat, but his grip tightened, forcing my hands into place. "Pressure," he said. "Maintain alignment." I pressed. My hands slipped immediately, slick with blood, his and others indistinguishable now, smearing red across blackened ceramite. I tried again, teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached, muscles trembling as I leaned my weight into the plate. The recoil from his weapon shuddered through both of us, each shot sending a violent tremor through the damaged section I was holding together. Every impact felt like my bones were being rattled loose. He recited battle, cant as he fired, his Vox intoning clipped phrases layered with ritual meaning, words of endurance, of sanctioned violence, of duty fulfilled through destruction. The cadence was steady, almost soothing in its certainty. I screamed prayers through clenched teeth, not because I believed they would save me, but because the pain demanded sound. My voice broke and cracked, hoarse and raw, my throat burning as badly as my hands. I begged the Emperor, the machine spirits, anything that might be listening, but the only response was the deafening roar of gunfire and the relentless advance of the war. Another impact struck his armor, close enough that the plate bucked under my hands. Pain exploded as my fingers were nearly crushed between shifting metal. I sobbed, incoherent, body shaking uncontrollably. "Hold," he repeated, as if the concept needed reinforcement rather than mercy. Something in my wrist gave way with a wet pop, pain lancing up my arm so fiercely I nearly blacked out. I screamed again, the sound tearing itself free, and for a moment my grip faltered. His gauntlet closed around my forearm, not roughly, but with absolute authority, and forced my hand back into position. "Failure is unacceptable," he said calmly. So I held. Time lost meaning in that moment. There was only heat, pressure, recoil, and pain layered so thickly it became a single, overwhelming sensation. The smell of ozone from his weapon burned my lungs with every breath. My arms shook violently, muscles spasming under strain, skin blistering and splitting where metal met flesh. Eventually, the firing slowed. The immediate threat subsided, reduced to distant explosions and scattered shots. The Space Marine lowered his weapon and finally looked down at the damage. He released me without comment, and I collapsed backward onto the rubble, hands clutching uselessly at the air, sobbing in ragged, broken gasps. He reached to his belt and withdrew a sealant canister, applying it to the fractured seam with practiced efficiency. The compound hissed and hardened, locking the plate into place. He flexed once, testing mobility, then nodded. "Functional," he said. "Functional." He did not thank me. He did not acknowledge my screams or my bloodied hands. He simply turned back toward the battle, already moving, already calculating the next engagement. I tried to stand and failed. My hands were a ruin, skin charred and torn, fingers trembling uncontrollably. My wrist throbbed with every heartbeat, swollen and misaligned. I could barely breathe, chest hitching painfully as adrenaline drained away and left only exhaustion and agony behind. The Space Marine noticed my failure only because it delayed him. He turned, looked down, and for a moment I saw something like consideration pass behind those unreadable lenses. Not empathy. Assessment. "You will recover," he said, not as reassurance, but as expectation. "Pain response is not terminal." He reached down, seized my collar once more, and hauled me to my feet despite my cry of protest. My injured wrist screamed as weight shifted, but he adjusted his grip without slowing, redistributing strain with mechanical precision. "Move," he ordered. "We are not finished." And we weren't. As we advanced again, deeper into the ruined city, I understood something essential about my role. I was not merely bait or burden. I was a component, a stopgap measure. Flesh used to solve a mechanical problem under fire, repairs made of blood. The Imperium did not waste resources, and I was still being spent. They brought others, not as relief, and certainly not as comrades, but as inventory. We reached a staging point carved out of a collapsed manufactorum, where the walls still stood by habit more than integrity. The ceiling sagged, held up by rusted struts and prayer seals pasted over stress fractures like excuses. Fires burned in oil pits along the edges, their smoke crawling low and thick, turning the air into something you chewed rather than breathed. That was where the Space Marine stopped long enough to be administrative. He activated the wrist slate again, the same one I had seen him use when the first carrier died under his load. Its surface glowed faintly through smoke and ash, lines of data scrolling too fast for me to read. Vox clicks followed, brief, precise, ritualized. "Additional assets required," he said to no one in particular. "Local availability acceptable." Acceptable. Moments later they were dragged in, civilians, penal laborers, half-trained militia pulled from barricades that no longer existed, men and women with the same hollow-eyed terror I must have worn hours ago. Some were wounded already. Some were starving. All of them were alive, which was the only qualification that mattered. They looked at him with awe and fear. They looked at me with confusion. I tried to warn them. I opened my mouth to speak, to say don't, to tell them that survival here was a lie, that usefulness was just another way to die slower, but my throat closed. No words came out. Maybe I knew even then that warning them would not change anything. The Imperium does not function on consent. He pointed. "You," he said to one. "Another. Forward element. Another. Reserve." Each word was a sentence passed without appeal. The chosen moved because they were told to move. The unchosen stayed because they were not yet required. I watched them learn the truth one by one. The first failed quickly. A thin man given a load his body could not stabilize under fire. He stumbled, fell, and did not get up again. The Space Marine logged the loss mid-stride, his gauntlet tapping the slate with practiced indifference. "Asset failure," he said. "Cause, structural inadequacy. No anger, no disappointment, just classification. Another lasted longer. She followed orders precisely, moved when told, froze when corrected. She screamed when a round took her side, but she kept moving, dragging herself forward until she collapsed behind cover, bleeding out into the rubble. When she stopped responding, the Space Marine stepped over her and reassigned her task to someone else. I realized then that I was not special. I had never been special. I had simply been early. The revelation hollowed something out of me that fear had not already consumed. I had mistaken duration for value, endurance for distinction. In truth, I was just a data point with a longer survival curve than most. A statistical outlier, not a chosen one. Hunger began to gnaw at me in earnest then, a deep, animal ache that made my hands shake worse than pain. I could not remember the last time I had eaten. My mouth felt dry and cracked, lips split and bleeding. My wounds oozed slowly, uncleaned, flies already gathering when we paused long enough for them to notice. No medica came. There was no time for inefficiency. We moved again, deeper into the war zone, the Space Marine always at the center of motion, a fixed point around which chaos organized itself. The others burned out quickly. Their bodies failed in predictable ways: exhaustion, panic, blood loss, shock. Each failure was noted. Each absence was absorbed seamlessly into the flow of violence. I learned what replaceability felt like. It was not despair. Despair implies loss of hope. I had passed that threshold already. Replaceability was quieter. It was the understanding that nothing I did here was unique, that every scream I tore from my throat had been screamed before, and would be screamed again by someone else when my voice failed. I was still alive because my body had not yet crossed the line where maintaining it cost more than replacing it. That was all. At one point, we paused briefly in the shell of a shrine. The walls were blackened, the altar shattered, sacred icons defaced by shrapnel and soot. A sensory still burned stubbornly in one corner, filling the space with bitter incense that stung the eyes. I slumped against a pillar, barely able to remain upright, my injured wrist throbbing with every heartbeat. The Space Marine stood nearby, weapon lowered but ready, helm turning in slow, deliberate arcs as he scanned for threats. I looked at him then, not with awe, not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. He was not cruel. That was the worst part. He did not hate me. He did not enjoy my suffering. He simply did not factor it in beyond how it affected operational capability. His brutality was not personal. It was institutional, sanctified, efficient. I was flesh in a system that had learned exactly how much flesh it could burn to keep moving. The slate chimed softly, asset degradation increasing. He noted aloud, sustainability window narrowing. He looked at me when he said it, lenses unreadable. I wondered if that was what a countdown felt like. When we moved again, my steps were slower, my reactions dulled. Pain had become constant, a background hum like tinnitus in the bones. Every breath scraped. Every movement felt delayed, as if my body were lagging behind my will. Still, I obeyed, because obedience was the only thing left to me that resembled identity. As night, or whatever passed for it beneath smoke and fire, began to settle, the battle intensified. Explosions lit the ruins in stuttering flashes. The Space Marine's pace quickened. His posture changed subtly, tension coiling through his massive frame. Something decisive was coming. I felt it in the way he looked at me again, not to assess condition, but to select. And in that moment, I understood with terrible certainty that my replaceability did not mean I would be discarded gently. It meant I would be used precisely. He chose me the way one chooses a tool already cracked along the handle. Because there was no time to find another, and because it would hold just long enough. The battle had reached a pitch where subtlety no longer mattered. The air itself felt shredded, thick with smoke and heat, vibrating constantly from overlapping detonations. The sky above the ruins was a churning smear of ash and firelight, offering no sense of direction or mercy. Vox traffic howled endlessly, a chorus of overlapping commands, casualty reports, and half-finished prayers cut short by screaming static. The Space Marine slowed for the first time since I had known him. Not stopping, never stopping, but slowing, the way a predator slows when it has finally identified the throat. His helm turned, lenses fixing on a ruined structure ahead, a fortified position squatting atop a collapsed transit junction. Heavy weapons fire poured from its upper levels, raking the advance and chewing through anything smaller than ceramite. The ground around it was littered with the remains of previous attempts, burned-out carriers, shattered bodies, scorch marks layered thick enough to tell a story without words. He looked down at me. I felt it immediately, the weight of that gaze pressing into whatever remained of my spine. I straightened instinctively, pain flaring everywhere at once, my body protesting the attempt to appear functional. My hands shook violently. My injured wrist had swollen grotesquely, fingers stiff and numb. Every breath came shallow and sharp. Stilled, necessary, he said. The word struck harder than any blow. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The meaning was already assembling itself in my mind, piece by dreadful piece. Necessary meant irreplaceable in this moment. Necessary meant no alternative that preserved anything more valuable than me. He gestured toward a satchel at his side and unhooked it with one smooth motion. Inside were demolition charges, compact, brutal devices designed to reshape architecture into absence. He pressed the satchel into my chest, the weight knocking the air from my lungs. Breach access is restricted, he said, voice steady. You will deploy charges at the internal support point. Detonation on my mark. Internal support point. I stared at him, mouth opening and closing uselessly. The fortified structure loomed ahead, its lower levels choked with rubble and fire. I could see the entrance he meant, a collapsed service shaft half, buried beneath debris, too narrow for power armor, too unstable for servitors, a place only something small, fragile, and expendable could reach. Me. There is no retreat, he added, not unkindly. Delay compromises advance. My ears rang. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might tear free of my chest. I wanted to ask how long. I wanted to ask what if. I wanted to ask why me, as if the answer might contain mercy. Instead, I nodded. The gesture felt strange, disconnected, as if it belonged to someone else. My body moved while my mind lagged behind, struggling to keep up with the inevitability unfolding. He guided me forward to the edge of cover, crouching beside me as heavy rounds slammed into the rubble beyond. The ground shook constantly now, tremors rolling through it like distant thunder. He placed one massive hand on my shoulder, not to restrain but to steady. Advance when firing shifts, he said. Do not hesitate. Do not hesitate. The command echoed through me, resonating with every correction, every shove, every painful lesson learned since he first pointed at me. Hesitation was failure. Failure was correction. Correction was extinction. The firing pattern changed, just slightly but enough. The Space Marine surged forward, weapon roaring, his presence drawing attention like a gravitational anomaly. Enemy fire focused on him instantly, tracers and energy bolts hammering into his armor. Now, he said. I ran, not blindly this time but with a terrible clarity. I knew exactly where I was going and exactly what awaited me there. The world narrowed again, but not into panic, into purpose. Every step was agony. My wounded legs screamed with each impact. My lungs burned, desperate for air that tasted only of smoke and death. I reached the collapsed shaft and dropped to my knees, clawing at debris with bare hands when the satchel snagged. Splinters of stone and metal tore into my palms, but I barely felt it. I forced myself into the opening, squeezing through jagged edges that scraped skin from my shoulders and back. Inside, the world became darkness and heat. The shaft sloped downward sharply, choked with dust and rubble. The air was thick and stale, unmoving. I crawled, dragging the satchel behind me, every movement sending jolts of pain through my body. My ears rang with the distant thunder of battle, muffled now, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the scrape of my body against stone. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the detonator when I reached the support point, a massive, cracked pillar of reinforced material, already stressed by bombardment. This was it, the heart of the structure. Destroy this, and everything above would follow. I fumbled with the charges, fingers clumsy and numb. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging, blurring my vision. My pulse roared in my ears, each beat counting down to something I could no longer name. I armed the charges. The detonator felt absurdly small in my hand. For a moment, just one, I considered not pressing it, staying there, letting the Space Marine find another way, letting the war grind on without my final contribution. But I knew better. Obedience was the only identity left to me. Without it, I was nothing but a malfunction. I pressed the signal stud. Nothing happened. I stared at the detonator in horror, thumb slamming the stud again and again, panic surging. Had I done something wrong? Had my shaking hands failed me at the final moment? Then his voice crackled through the vox, beat I hadn't even realized he had placed in my ear. "Clear the breach," he said. "Detonation imminent." Clear. There was no time to move back through the shaft. No space to turn around. I looked at the charges, at the cracked support, at the narrow darkness pressing in on all sides. I laughed. It was a broken, hysterical sound, half sob, half breath. The absurdity of it all finally overwhelmed whatever restraint I had left. After everything, after being bait, burden, brace, replacement, I had been brought here to be the final obstruction removed. I closed my eyes. In that last moment before the world ended, I did not think of the Emperor, or glory, or honor. I thought of paperwork, of ledgers, of the word necessary stamped somewhere in a report already being drafted. And then the charges went off. The explosion did not arrive as sound. Sound requires space to travel, and there was no space left where I was. The first thing to reach me was pressure, absolute, total, crushing, slamming inward from every direction at once. It folded the air, the stone, my body, compressing everything into a single violent instant. Heat followed immediately, not as warmth but as erasure, a white, featureless intensity that burned away distinction. For a fraction of a heartbeat, an administrative margin so small it barely deserved the name, I was still conscious. In that sliver of time, the world existed only as sensation without shape. My ears rang, not with noise, but with absence. My skin felt as though it were dissolving, nerve endings screaming and then falling silent one by one. The detonator was gone. My hands were gone. Pain flared everywhere at once and then lost cohesion, breaking apart into something too large and too final to process. The structure above me began to fail. I felt it through the ground before I understood it. A deep, cascading collapse, layers of mass surrendering to gravity in obedient sequence. Support beams sheared. Stone screamed as it fractured. The fortified position, the thing I had been sent to unmake, obeyed physics and fell inward, exactly as calculated. Somewhere beyond the collapsing shaft, beyond the smoke and flame and disintegrating architecture, the space marine advanced. I could not see him. I did not need to. I knew him now the way one knows inevitability, not through sight, but through consequence. He would not pause. He would not look back. The breach I had created would be assessed, logged, exploited. His mission would continue uninterrupted, smoother now, more efficient. My usefulness had peaked. As darkness pressed in, not metaphorical darkness, but the literal failure of systems that sustained awareness, I felt something strange: relief. Not comfort, not peace. Relief in the sense that a task had finally ended. The tension that had defined every second since he first pointed at me began to drain away, leaving behind a hollow quiet. In that quiet, thoughts surfaced unbidden, not memories of family or home. Those had been burned away earlier, stripped of relevance by pain and fear, but abstractions, words, classifications, asset deployed, objective achieved, losses acceptable. I imagined the report being compiled even now, data flowing into a slate somewhere far above the ruins. Time stamps, casualty figures, structural impact assessments. My presence reduced to a single line item, flagged and resolved. Human auxiliary expended, justification tactical necessity. There would be no name attached to it. Names complicate records. Names invite questions. I would be a numeral, a quantity consumed to achieve momentum, a cost offset by gain. The war would not slow. Even as the last fragments of the structure collapsed inward, even as fire and dust consumed the space where I had been, the larger conflict pressed on with mechanical indifference. Artillery continued to thunder. Orders continued to flow through vox networks. Other civilians elsewhere, unknowingly, were being noticed, selected, classified as useful. I wondered, dimly, if any of them prayed to survive. If they did, I hoped the prayer went unanswered. Because survival, I had learned too late, was not mercy. It was conscription by chance. It was being seen by something vast and inhuman and deemed efficient to spend. As sensation faded further, my thoughts became simpler, smaller. The idea of me lost coherence. There was only function and outcome, input and result. I had been placed into the equation at the correct moment, and the equation had balanced. That was all the Imperium required. In my final confession, if it can be called that, when no one listens and absolution is not a concept that applies, I understood the quiet truth buried beneath all the hymns and banners and sermons. Usefulness is not an honor. It is not recognition. It is not purpose. Usefulness is a sentence, and in the Imperium of man, sentences end only when the flesh is gone and the ledger is satisfied.